Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Jake Frostbane, and I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know what really happened up there in the Alaska wilderness. I've been a park ranger for 15 years now, working the coldest, most dangerous places where most people would die in hours. But what I saw during the winter of 1967 still keeps me awake at night. I'm 38 years old and I've seen things that would break most men. I fought in Korea, watched my whole squad get killed by Chinese forces while I hid in a foxhole like a coward. When I came back, I couldn't stand being around people. The guilt ate at me every day. So I became a ranger and asked for the worst assignments they had. The lonelier and more dangerous, the better. That's how I ended up at gates of the Arctic National Park in Alaska, 150 miles north of the Arctic Circle. There are no roads up there, no towns, no cell phone towers, just ice, snow, and darkness that goes on for months. The nearest settlement is Anaktavuk Pass, 60 miles south, and even that's just a tiny Inupiat village. I lived alone in a cabin that the Park Service built for emergency operations. My job was simple. When people got lost or hurt in the northern Alaska wilderness, I went out and found them. Or found what was left of them. In 15 years, I'd rescued 47 people from situations that should have killed them. I knew every glacier, every frozen river, every ice cave within 100 miles. The local Inupiat people had stories about that land, old stories passed down for generations. They talked about things called tornarsuk, giant spirits that walked on ice and hunted during the polar night. The elders would warn me about voices that called from empty places and shadows that moved without anything to cast them. I never believed any of it. I figured the stories were just ways to teach kids not to wander off during the long winter. When you live in a place where the sun doesn't rise for 2 months and the temperature stays at 40 below zero, your mind can play tricks on you. Cabin fever makes people see things that aren't there. But the old-timers kept warning me. Something walks the ice when the aurora lights dance, they'd say. Something hungry. February 1967 was the worst winter I'd ever seen. The sun had been gone for 2 months, and we still had another month of darkness to go. The temperature hadn't risen above -40 in 3 weeks, and the Weather Service was predicting it would drop to -60 with the next storm. I had enough supplies in my cabin to last 30 days without resupply. My snowmobile was in perfect condition, and I had backup equipment for everything. My radio worked twice a day for check-ins with the base in Fairbanks, 8 hours away by snowmobile. Everything was routine. Then, on February 15th, I got the call that changed everything. "Jake, this is dispatch," the voice crackled over the radio through the static. "We've got a problem. 3-person geological survey team is 6 days overdue. Last radio contact was February 9th. I checked my logs. What was their last reported position? Arrogech Peaks region, about 20 miles northeast of your location. They were mapping ice formations for the university. Last transmission said something about hearing someone walking on the river ice at night. That should have been my first warning. Nobody walks on river ice at night in February. Nobody who wants to live, anyway. I'll head out at first light," I told dispatch. "Negative, Jake. Storm's coming in. Weather Service says it'll hit hard tonight and last 3 days. You wait until it passes." But I knew how these things worked. Every hour those people spent out there in the cold made it less likely I'd find them alive. And something about that last transmission bothered me. Someone walking on the river ice at night? In -40 weather? During the polar night? It didn't make sense. The storm hit that night like a freight train. Wind howled around my cabin so loud I couldn't hear my own radio. Snow piled up against the windows until I couldn't see outside. For 3 days, I was trapped inside, while somewhere out there, 3 people were dying in the cold. When the storm finally passed, I loaded my snowmobile and headed out. The morning was crystal clear, but the cold was brutal. My breath froze before it left my mouth. The snow crunched under my tracks with a sound like breaking glass. I followed the survey team's planned route, checking every shelter and landmark they should have passed. The landscape was beautiful in a deadly way. White peaks stretching to the horizon under a sky full of stars. The aurora borealis danced green and blue overhead, casting weird shadows on the snow. I found their snowmobiles first. 3 machines sitting in the middle of a frozen river, perfectly arranged in a line. Engines off, but the gas tanks were full. Keys still in the ignition, no signs of mechanical trouble, no signs of struggle. The machines looked like someone had just parked them there and walked away. But that made no sense. You don't abandon working snowmobiles in the Arctic unless you want to die. I checked the tracks around the machines. Boot prints led away from the snowmobiles toward the riverbank, but they were wrong somehow. Too deep, like whoever made them was carrying extra weight. And they glowed slightly in the starlight, as if the snow had been compressed so hard it turned to ice. My compass started acting strange near the snowmobiles. The needle spun in slow circles, never settling on magnetic north. When I tried to radio dispatch, all I got was static and what sounded like voices speaking backwards. I followed the tracks to an emergency shelter about half a mile away. The survey team had set up a proper camp, tent, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, but when I looked inside the tent, my blood turned cold. The walls were covered in ice from the inside. Not frost, solid ice, like the tent had been sprayed with water that froze instantly. The sleeping bags were arranged in a perfect circle around a cold fire pit, and there were no people anywhere. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the food. Someone had opened every can and package in their supplies, but instead of eating the food, they'd bitten through the metal cans. Huge bite marks, like someone with a mouth 12 inches wide had tried to eat aluminum and frozen beans together. And the bites were arranged in patterns, circles within circles, like some kind of ritual. I'd seen a lot of strange things in 15 years of rescue work, but this was different. This felt wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. I tried to think of rational explanations. Maybe they'd gotten carbon monoxide poisoning from their heater and done crazy things before they died. Maybe bears had gotten into their food after they left. But I knew there were no bears active in February. And the bite marks were too big, too organized. That's when I heard the voices. They came from across the frozen river, clear as day despite the distance. 3 voices calling for help, a man and 2 women, just like the missing survey team. "Help us, we're trapped, please." I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the far riverbank. Nothing. I pulled out my thermal scope, which would show body heat from a mile away. Still nothing. But the voices kept calling. Then I realized something that made my stomach drop. The voices weren't just calling for help. They were repeating the exact words from the survey team's last radio transmission, the one dispatch had played for me before I left. Word for word, tone for tone, like a recording. I called back to them, "Where are you? I can't see you." The voices stopped. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, after about a minute, I heard my own voice calling back from the darkness. "Where are you? I can't see you." Perfect mimicry. But I hadn't said those words yet when I heard my voice repeat them. It was like hearing an echo from the future. That's when the storm clouds rolled in again, and I realized I was about to be trapped in the same place where 3 people had vanished. My radio crackled with the voice of my dispatcher. "Jake, new storm system, moving in fast. You need to find shelter immediately. This one's going to be worse than the last." I looked around at the abandoned camp, the strange ice formations, the glowing tracks that led nowhere. Every instinct I had told me to get out of there, but the nearest shelter that could handle a bad storm was 8 miles away, and the clouds were already blocking out the stars. I was going to have to stay where 3 people had disappeared. And something in the darkness was using their voices to call to me. I set up my emergency shelter about 100 yards from the abandoned survey camp, close enough to investigate but far enough away to make a run for it if I needed to. The wind was picking up and the temperature was dropping fast. I had maybe an hour before the storm hit full force. I decided to search the area while I still could. Using my headlamp, I followed the glowing tracks along the riverbank. They led to a series of ice caves formed by the current under the frozen river. Natural formations, but something about them felt wrong. Inside the first cave, I found camping equipment from other expeditions. Different years, different brands. Some of it looked decades old. I counted gear from at least 6 different groups, all abandoned, all arranged in the same circular patterns I'd seen at the survey camp. In the deepest cave, I found something that made me want to run screaming into the storm. Human faces, perfectly preserved in the ice walls, men and women of different ages, frozen mid-scream. Their eyes followed me as I moved. Their mouths opened and closed slowly, like they were trying to speak but no sound came out. I stumbled backwards and ran for my shelter. Behind me, I heard voices calling, not just the 3 survey team members now, but dozens of voices. All of them begging for help in perfect unison. Inside my shelter, I tried to radio for help, but the storm was interfering with everything electronic. My GPS showed impossible readings. Sometimes I was 1,000 feet underground, sometimes I was floating in midair. My compass spun like a broken top. The storm hit around midnight, but it wasn't like any storm I'd experienced. The aurora borealis blazed brighter than ever, turning the snow green and blue. The lights seemed to dance in rhythm with voices outside my tent. That's when I saw it for the first time. Through the wind and snow, a massive figure walked across the frozen river. It stood at least 15 feet tall, human-shaped but wrong in every detail. Its skin looked like blue ice with black veins running underneath. It moved too smoothly, like it was gliding instead of walking, and it was heading straight for me. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside. The creature was close enough now that I could see its face, human features, but stretched and distorted. Its mouth was huge, filled with teeth like broken ice. Its eyes glowed the same green as the aurora above. "You're not real," I said, mostly to convince myself. The thing tilted its head and spoke in my own voice. "You're not real." Then, it spoke in the voice of my dead squadmate from Korea, the one who died calling for me to help him. "Jake, why didn't you save me? Why did you let us die?" I aimed my rifle and fired 3 shots center mass. The bullets passed right through it like it was made of air. The creature laughed with the voices of everyone I'd failed to save. It walked through my shelter without breaking stride, leaving no tracks, making no sound except for the voices of the dead. When it was gone, I found that everything electronic in my camp had stopped working. Radio, GPS, even my watch. I was completely alone, with no way to call for help. The next morning brought no sun, just a slightly lighter shade of darkness. The storm had passed, but the cold was worse than ever. My breath came out in clouds that froze and fell to the ground like snow. I searched the abandoned survey camp again and found new evidence, more faces in the ice, including 3 fresh ones that looked like the missing survey team. They were still alive, still trying to scream, but the worst discovery was in my own notebook. During the night, someone had written in it, pages and pages of notes in my own handwriting, describing things I'd never seen, conversations I'd never had. The writing talked about feeding the ice walker, about joining the voices in the caves, about the hunger that never ended. I don't remember writing any of it. That night, the creature returned. This time it brought friends. Dozens of figures walked across the ice, all of them wrong, all of them hungry. They surrounded my shelter and called to me in the voices of everyone I'd ever known. My mother, who died when I was 12. My commanding officer from Korea. Every person I'd rescued over the years. They all had the same message. "Come outside, Jake. Come feed the ice." I realized then that this wasn't random. The creature wasn't just hunting anyone who wandered into its territory. It was hunting me specifically. It knew about my past, my guilt, my failures, and it was using them against me. The aurora blazed brighter, and through my shelter wall, I could see the creature's true form. Not quite human, not quite animal. Something ancient and hungry that had been feeding on lost travelers for hundreds of years. Something that had been waiting for someone like me. Someone already haunted by the dead. On the 3rd night, I found out what the creature really was. I was searching through the survey team's equipment when I discovered something they'd dug up from the permafrost. Ancient bones arranged around a carved stone tablet. The carving showed the story in crude pictures. A shaman from an Inupiat village who'd turned to cannibalism during a terrible winter. The villagers had banished him to the ice, where he died cursing their names. But death hadn't stopped him. The tablet showed how he'd become something else, part human, part Wendigo, part ice spirit, fed by hunger and hatred, growing stronger with every person who died in his territory. The creature had been killing travelers for centuries, keeping their voices and memories as trophies. And now it wanted mine. I finally understood why my equipment kept failing, why the aurora lights danced when it was near. The creature existed partially outside normal space, able to phase through matter and manipulate electromagnetic fields. That's why my compass spun and my radio picked up impossible signals. But the tablet showed something else, a weakness. During the aurora displays, when electromagnetic activity peaked, the creature became solid, vulnerable. That's when I heard footsteps outside my shelter. Not the silent gliding of the ice walker, but real footsteps crunching in snow. I peered outside and saw 3 figures stumbling toward me across the frozen river. The missing survey team, but something was wrong with them. They moved like puppets with cut strings. Their eyes were solid white. Their mouths hung open, showing frozen breath that never stopped coming. "Jake," the lead figure called in a voice like breaking glass. "We found something wonderful down in the ice. Come see." Behind them, the aurora exploded across the sky in patterns I'd never seen before. Green and blue flames dancing directly overhead, so bright they turned the snow into rainbow prisms. And walking behind the possessed survey team was the ice walker itself, 15 feet tall and terrible. During the aurora peak, I could see its true form clearly. Ancient human bones wrapped in translucent ice flesh, black veins pulsing with aurora light. Its face was a nightmare combination of every person it had ever consumed. "Join us," it said in the voice of my dead squad from Korea. "Stop running from what you are. Stop fighting the hunger." I realized then that it wasn't just feeding on bodies, it was feeding on guilt, on the weight of everyone I'd failed to save. Every person I'd lost, every rescue I'd been too late for, it had been calling to this creature, drawing it to me. But I also realized something else. In Korea, I'd survived when my squad died, not because I was a coward, but because I was supposed to survive. I was supposed to learn from it, to use that knowledge to save others. I'd spent 15 years in the wilderness, saving people, because that's what I was meant to do. And I wasn't done yet. The aurora blazed brighter, and the creature solidified. I could see its form clearly now, not invincible, not unstoppable, just old and hungry and tired. I grabbed the thermite charges from the survey team's equipment. They'd been using them to melt core samples from the permafrost. Military training kicked in as I rigged them around the main support beam of the ice cave system. "You want to feed on guilt?" I called to the creature as it approached. "Then you picked the wrong man. I'm done feeling sorry for myself." The ice walker lunged at me with impossible speed, but the aurora peaked at that exact moment. Its claws, solid now, raked across my chest instead of passing through me harmlessly. I triggered the thermite charges. The explosion lit up the landscape like daylight. Tons of ice and permafrost collapsed, burying the ice walker and its feeding chambers. The aurora suddenly went out like someone had thrown a switch, leaving us in normal darkness. The possessed survey team members collapsed, gasping and shivering but alive. The voices in the caves went silent. My equipment started working again, but as I helped the survivors to safety, I could feel the creature's presence in the darkness below the collapsed ice. Trapped, maybe, hurt, probably, but not dead. Something that had survived for centuries wouldn't be stopped by one explosion. It was just sleeping now, waiting for the ice to shift, waiting for the aurora to return, waiting for the next lost soul to wander into its territory. The rescue helicopters found us 2 days later. The survey team was alive but traumatized. They had no memory of the past week, just vague nightmares about voices calling from the ice. The official report blamed carbon monoxide poisoning from their faulty heater for their strange behavior and memory loss. I didn't argue with the official story. Who would believe the truth? But I made changes in my life after that. I started talking to the Inupiat elders, learning their stories about the things that lived in the deep wilderness. Stories I'd dismissed as superstition turned out to be survival guides passed down through generations of people who knew the truth about places like the Arctic. I became an unofficial liaison between the Park Service and the native communities, documenting their knowledge about supernatural threats. Most of my superiors thought I was just being culturally sensitive, but a few understood what I was really doing. I'm 53 now, 15 years since that winter. I still work the wilderness, but I'm more careful about where I go and when. I carry different equipment now, blessed items from Inupiat shamans alongside my standard gear. And I watch the aurora forecasts more carefully than the weather reports. Because every winter, when the polar night begins and the electromagnetic storms peak, I feel something stirring under the ice up north. Something patient and hungry, counting the years until the ice shifts enough for it to dig its way out. The survey team members move to warmer climates and never return to Alaska. Smart choice. But every February, around the anniversary of their experience, they call me with the same dream. Voices calling from a dark place, begging them to come back and finish what they started. I tell them it's just trauma, just their minds processing what they went through. But I know better. The ice walker isn't done with any of us. It's just waiting for the right moment, the right conditions, the right weakness to exploit. And when that moment comes, it'll be ready. That's why I'm telling you this story. Not to scare you, but to warn you. If you're ever in the deep wilderness during the polar night, and you hear voices calling from empty places, don't listen. Don't investigate. Don't try to help. Just run. And if you can't run, remember what I learned that night. The only way to survive something that feeds on your guilt and fear is to stop feeding it. Face what you've done wrong, forgive yourself for what you couldn't control, and focus on what you can do right going forward. The ice walker is still out there, somewhere under the frozen ground, waiting, hungry, patient as the glacier that holds it. But it's not invincible. It can be fought, it can be stopped, it can be trapped. Just don't expect it to stay trapped forever. The aurora borealis still dances over the Arctic wilderness every winter, beautiful and terrible and strange. And sometimes, when the lights are brightest, rangers working the northern territories report hearing voices calling from the darkness. Voices asking for help. Voices that sound just like their own. My name is Robert Steelclaw, but everyone calls me Bear. I've been a park ranger on Kodiak Island for 8 years now, and I know these woods better than most people know their own backyard. The thing is, I thought I knew everything about the bears here too. I was wrong. It's September 1954, and I'm stationed way out at Terror Lake in the southwestern part of Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge. This place is about as far from civilization as you can get in Alaska. The nearest town is Old Harbor, 25 miles away, through some of the most dangerous bear country in the world. The only way in or out is by seaplane or a 15-mile hike that'll test your nerves and your luck. I've been tracking brown bears for 8 years, and let me tell you, these aren't your average bears. Kodiak browns are the biggest bears in the world. A full-grown male can weigh over 1,500 pounds and stand 10 feet tall on his back legs. I've photographed over 200 individual bears, and I can tell them apart just by watching how they walk or where they mark their territory. My grandmother was Aleut, and she used to tell me stories when I was little. Stories about something called Palryjuk, bears that used to be men. She'd say these weren't regular bears, but people who got cursed and had to live as bears forever. They kept their human minds, but got the hunger and strength of a bear. I never believed those stories. Figured they were just old country tales to keep kids from wandering into the woods alone. In my 8 years out here, I've had 12 direct encounters with bears, and not once did I need to shoot one. You learn their patterns, respect their space, and they'll usually leave you alone. But this September feels different. The salmon run is at its peak, which should make the bears happy and well-fed. Instead, something's got them all worked up. There have been 3 attacks on fishing camps in the past 2 weeks. That's more attacks than we usually see in a whole year. I live in a small cabin about a mile from Terror Lake. My wife Mary teaches school back in town, and she worries about me being out here alone. We got married last year, and she still hasn't gotten used to me being gone for weeks at a time. I radio her every evening at 6 o'clock, assuming the mountains don't interfere with the signal. The weather's starting to turn cold, and we're losing daylight fast. By October, we'll only have about 10 hours of sun each day. The bears are getting ready for winter, which means they're eating everything they can find. It's the most dangerous time to be out here. Yesterday, I got a radio call from headquarters about another attack. This one was different, though. A fishing camp with 6 men got completely destroyed, but none of the men made it out to tell what happened. The state troopers found the camp 2 days later, and what they saw didn't make sense. According to the report, the bear tracks around the camp showed something impossible. The bears had worked together like a team. Some tracks showed bears using rocks as tools to break into the food storage. There were even signs that the bears had taken turns fishing, like they were following some kind of plan. I've been studying bear behavior my whole career, and I've never seen anything like this. Bears are smart, don't get me wrong, but they don't use tools and they don't work in organized groups. Each bear has its own territory, and they only come together during mating season or when there's a huge food source like a salmon run. But there was something else that bothered me about the report. The troopers found human footprints around the camp that seemed to change into bear tracks partway through. The official report said it was probably just overlapping tracks from the attack, but I've been tracking animals long enough to know what a clear print looks like. I'm heading out to investigate the site myself tomorrow morning. Something's not right out there, and I need to see it with my own eyes. 8 years protecting folks from Kodiak browns, and I thought I understood them. Bears follow predictable patterns. They eat, they sleep, they defend their territory, and they avoid humans when they can. But what if my grandmother was right? What if some bears do think like men? I flew out to the attack site early this morning in my float plane. The fishing camp was located on a small inlet about 12 miles north of my station, in an area where 3 salmon streams come together. Perfect bear country, but also the kind of place experienced fishermen know how to set up safely. The scene hit me as soon as I stepped out of the plane. The camp looked like a bomb had gone off. Tents were shredded, but not randomly like you'd see in a normal bear attack. The tiers were clean and methodical, like someone had taken time to cut them open in specific places. The camp's food storage containers were broken open, but again, the damage was too organized. These weren't desperate bears clawing randomly for food. I started documenting everything with my camera, taking photos from every angle like I always do. That's when I noticed the tracks. 6 different sets of bear prints, all adult males by the size of them. They moved around the camp in what looked like a planned formation. 1 set came from the north, 2 from the east, 1 from the south, and 2 from the west. They had surrounded the camp completely before attacking. But the strangest thing was what I found near the main campfire. A circle of rocks had been arranged in a perfect pattern, and in the center was a wooden spear about 4 feet long. Not a stick or a broken branch, an actual carved spear with a sharp point. Bears don't make spears. I picked up the spear to examine it closer, and the wood was still warm even though the morning air was cold. The carving work was rough but effective, like someone had made it in a hurry but knew what they were doing. My camera started acting up when I tried to photograph the spear. The pictures came out blurry or double exposed, showing strange shadows that weren't there when I looked through the viewfinder. I've never had problems with this camera before, and I've used it in all kinds of weather. I followed the bear tracks away from the camp, hoping to get some idea of where they had come from. The trail led me through thick alder bushes toward a small creek about a quarter mile away. That's where things got really strange. The creek showed signs of systematic fishing. Someone or something had built small rock dams to control the water flow and trap salmon in shallow pools. The dams were built with careful engineering, not something that would happen naturally or by accident. I found fish that had been cleaned and prepared, not torn apart like bears usually do. The heads and bones were piled in meat stacks, and the meat was laid out on flat rocks to dry in the sun. This looked more like a human fishing operation than anything a bear would do. Then I heard the sound. It came from upstream, a low rumbling that could have been a bear's growl. But there was something else mixed in with it, something that sounded almost like words. I crept closer, trying to stay downwind so whatever was making the noise wouldn't catch my scent. What I saw made my blood run cold. A huge brown bear, easily 1,200 pounds, was standing knee-deep in the creek. In his front paws, he held a wooden spear just like the one I'd found at the camp. He was using it to stab salmon with incredible precision, then placing each fish carefully on the bank in an organized row. But that wasn't the worst part. The bear was talking, not making normal bear sounds, but actually forming words. The words were backwards and hard to understand, but I could make out English mixed in with what sounded like my grandmother's Aleut language. The bear was counting the fish as he caught them. I fumbled for my camera, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it steady. I managed to get one shot before the bear's head snapped up and looked directly at me. For a moment, our eyes met across the water. Those weren't bear eyes looking back at me. They were human eyes, full of intelligence and anger, trapped in a bear's massive skull. The bear dropped the spear and charged toward my hiding spot. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the alders and jumping over fallen logs like my life depended on it. Because it did. I didn't stop running until I reached my plane. And I didn't stop shaking until I was back at my cabin, with the door locked and my rifle loaded. I tried to develop the photos I'd taken, but they all came out wrong. The images of the bear showed a strange double exposure, like there were two figures in the same space, one bear and one human, overlapping each other. That night, I radioed Mary like always, but I didn't tell her what I'd seen. How could I? She'd think I was losing my mind from too much time alone in the woods. But as I was getting ready for bed, I heard something outside my cabin. Footsteps in the leaves, too heavy to be human, but too measured to be a regular bear. I looked out the window and saw tracks in the moonlight, human footprints that changed into bear paws halfway across my yard. Something was watching me, and it knew I had seen too much. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound outside made me reach for my rifle. Around 3 a.m, I heard something large moving around the cabin, testing the walls and windows like it was looking for a way inside. Whatever it was smart enough to stay in the shadows where I couldn't get a clear look at it. When morning finally came, I found bear claw marks on my cabin walls that spelled out letters. Not random scratches, but actual words carved into the wood. Leave now. That should have scared me enough to pack up and head back to town. Instead, it made me angry. I've been protecting these woods for 8 years, and I wasn't about to let some strange bears run me off. Besides, if these things really were what my grandmother called palraijuk, then people needed to know about them. There were fishing camps and hunting parties all over this area. I spent the next 3 days mapping out every strange incident I could find. The pattern that emerged made my skin crawl. The attacks weren't random. Every camp that got hit was isolated, with small groups of men who fished alone. The bears, or whatever they were, seemed to know exactly when the camps would be most vulnerable. They attacked during shift changes, when guards were tired, or when the men were focused on hauling in nets. I found evidence of at least 7 different bear things working together. Their tracks showed up at multiple attack sites, always in the same organized formation. They were learning from each attack, getting better at hunting humans. The worst part was what I discovered at a camp that had been attacked just 2 days before. The site was still fresh, and I could piece together what had happened. 5 fishermen had been working the site for a week. According to the lone survivor I managed to track down in Old Harbor, they had started noticing strange things a few days before the attack. Bears that walked on their back legs for too long. Sounds from the forest that almost sounded like human voices. Fish disappearing from their lines in ways that didn't make sense. The survivor, a guy named Pete Morrison, was shaking when he told me what he'd seen during the attack. He said the bears came out of the woods like soldiers, moving in perfect coordination. But the thing that really got to him was that one of the bears looked exactly like his fishing partner, Tom, who had disappeared the day before. It had Tom's face, Pete kept saying, same nose, same scar on his chin from when we were kids. But it was a bear's body, and its teeth. God, those teeth. I thought Pete was just traumatized and confused until I found Tom's clothes laid out in a perfect circle in the woods near the camp. The clothes weren't torn or bloody. They were folded neatly, like someone had carefully taken them off and arranged them for a ceremony. That night, I decided to set up surveillance near one of the salmon streams where I'd seen the most activity. I brought my best camera, extra film, and enough coffee to stay awake all night. Around midnight, they came. 7 bears emerged from the forest, walking single file like a military patrol. The largest one, the same bear I'd seen fishing with the spear, seemed to be giving orders through low growls and hand gestures. Yes, hand gestures. The bears were using their front paws to point and signal to each other like humans. They spread out around the stream in a pattern I recognized from my Navy days, a classic ambush formation. These bears had military training, or at least military intelligence. I watched through my camera lens as they began fishing, but not like any bears I'd ever seen. They worked in shifts, with some fishing, while others stood guard. The fish they caught were processed and stored in organized piles, like they were building up supplies for something big. Then I saw something that nearly made me drop my camera. One of the smaller bears began to change. Its snout shortened, its fur receded, and its body shrank and shifted. Within minutes, it had transformed into a human man, naked and covered in dirt, but definitely human. The man walked into the stream and began fishing with his bare hands, moving with inhuman speed and precision. After catching several fish, the man returned to shore and began the transformation back into a bear. I watched his bones crack and lengthen, his face push forward into a snout, and thick brown fur sprout across his skin. The whole process took about 5 minutes and looked incredibly painful. I had to get this on film. I started taking pictures as quietly as I could, but the camera flash reflected off a wet rock and gave away my position. 7 pairs of glowing eyes turned toward my hiding spot. The largest bear stood up on its hind legs and spoke in a voice that was part growl, part human speech. "Robert Steelclaw, we know you are watching." My heart nearly stopped. The thing knew my name. "Your grandmother told you stories about us. She understood what we are. You must understand too." The bear dropped to all fours and began moving toward me, followed by the others. I ran again, but this time I knew they were hurting me. Every time I tried to go left or right, one of them would appear from the shadows to cut me off. They drove me back toward my cabin like they were following a plan. When I finally reached my front door, gasping and exhausted, I found a message waiting for me. Scratched into the dirt of my front yard were coordinates, the exact location of the old Russian Orthodox church, about 15 miles south of my station. Below the coordinates was a date, tomorrow night, and below that, carved deep into the earth, were 2 words that made my blood freeze. Mary Steelclaw. They knew about my wife, and they wanted me to come to them. I didn't radio Mary that night. I couldn't risk it, not when those things might be listening to our frequency. Instead, I spent the dark hours loading my rifle with every type of ammunition I had, including some old blessed silver bullets my grandmother had given me years ago. I'd always thought they were just a sentimental gift, but now I was hoping they might actually work. At sunrise, I flew to Old Harbor to check on Mary, but her school was closed and no one had seen her since yesterday afternoon. My worst fears were coming true. The coordinates led me to the ruins of a Russian Orthodox church that had been abandoned for over 50 years. The building was mostly collapsed, but the stone walls and bell tower were still standing. As I approached on foot, I could smell something that made my stomach turn, the scent of rotting meat mixed with something wild and animal. I found Mary tied to a post inside the ruined church. She was unconscious but alive, and I could see bite marks on her arms that looked like they came from human teeth, not bear fangs. "We did not hurt her badly," a voice said behind me. "Not yet." I spun around to see the largest bear from the stream standing in the doorway. Up close, it was even more massive than I'd thought, easily 10 feet tall and probably close to 1,800 pounds. But its eyes were completely human, intelligent and cunning. "My name was Ivan Volkov," the bear said, its voice a strange mixture of growls and human speech. "I was one of 7 men who came to this island in 1889, during the worst winter anyone could remember. We were starving, and we did things. Things that changed us forever." 2. Around the church, 6 other bears emerged from the shadows. Some were in full bear form, others were partially transformed with human faces on bear bodies. All of them watched me with intelligent, hungry eyes. "The curse is simple," Ivan continued. "When a man eats human flesh to survive, and does so wearing the skin of a bear, he becomes something new. We keep our human minds, but we gain the strength and hunger of the greatest predators on earth. We become immortal, but we must feed on human flesh to maintain our power." I raised my rifle, but Ivan just laughed. A horrible sound coming from a bear's throat. "You cannot kill us with regular bullets, Robert Steelclaw. We have survived for 65 years by being smarter and stronger than anything that hunts us, but we offer you a choice." He gestured toward Mary with one massive paw. "Join us willingly, and we will let your wife live. You will become like us, immortal, powerful, free from the weakness of human flesh. All you must do is feed with us during the new moon and complete the transformation ritual. And if I refuse, then you will watch us tear her apart piece by piece. And then we will hunt you through these woods until you beg for the mercy of joining our pack." I looked at Mary, still unconscious and helpless, then at the 7 monsters surrounding me. My grandmother's stories were all true, but she'd never told me how to fight these things. The silver bullets were my only hope. "I have a different offer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. How about I send you all back to hell where you belong? I fired at Ivan, aiming for center mass. The silver bullet hit him in the chest and he screamed, not a bear's roar, but a human scream of agony. Black blood poured from the wound, and for a moment, I could see the ghostly outline of a human man overlapping the bear's body. The other 6 attacked simultaneously. I've been in combat before, during the war, but nothing prepared me for fighting a pack of intelligent, shape-shifting bears in the ruins of a church. They moved with coordinated precision, trying to separate me from my rifle and force me into close combat where their size and strength would give them the advantage. I managed to drop 2 more with silver bullets, but the rifle only held 5 shots, and I was down to my last 2 rounds. The remaining bears began circling me, and I could see them starting to transform. Their bodies shifted and changed, giving them human dexterity while keeping their bear strength. That's when Mary woke up. She saw what was happening and began screaming, which distracted one of the bears long enough for me to put a silver bullet through its skull. But now I was down to my last shot, and there were still 3 bears left, including Ivan. Ivan was badly wounded but far from dead. The silver had hurt him, but not enough to stop him. He began his own transformation, shifting into something that was neither fully human nor fully bear. A nightmare creature with human intelligence, bear strength, and the worst aspects of both. You cannot win, Steelclaw, he growled. Even if you kill us all, the curse will spread. There are others like us in these woods. Others who have fed on human flesh and learned the old ways. You have only delayed the inevitable. I had 1 bullet left and 3 targets. The smart thing would have been to save it for Ivan, but as I watched, one of the smaller bears began moving toward Mary with clear predatory intent. I made my choice and shot it in the head. Now I was out of ammunition, facing Ivan and 1 other bear, with nothing but my knife and my bare hands. They spread out to attack me from different angles, and I knew this was probably where my story would end. But then I remembered my grandmother's crucifix, the silver one she'd given me when I first became a ranger. I pulled it from my pocket and held it up just as Ivan lunged for my throat. The silver cross burned his flesh where it touched, and he recoiled with another terrible scream. The other bear hesitated, suddenly uncertain. The old faith, Ivan gasped. Where did you get that? My grandmother knew what you were, I said, advancing on him with the crucifix extended. She knew how to fight you. Ivan tried to back away, but his wounds were slowing him down. I pressed the silver cross against his forehead, and this time his scream shook the entire ruined church. His body began to convulse and change, shifting rapidly between human and bear forms like he was losing control of the transformation. This is not possible, he gasped as his bear form began to fade. We are immortal. Nothing that feeds on human suffering is immortal, I said, pressing the cross deeper into his flesh. My grandmother taught me that too. Ivan's body collapsed, finally settling into the form of an elderly human man with deep wounds across his chest. He looked up at me with dying eyes and whispered something in Russian before going still. The last bear turned and ran into the forest. I let it go. I was too exhausted to chase it, and Mary needed medical attention. But as I untied her and helped her to her feet, I could hear something howling in the distance. Not a wolf's howl or a bear's roar, but something else, something that sounded almost like human voices calling out in harmony. Ivan had been telling the truth. There were others out there, and now they knew I could hurt them. The military arrived 3 days later. They called it a wildlife management operation and spent 2 weeks combing through the area with helicopters and hunting teams. Officially, they were eliminating problem bears that had developed aggressive behavior toward humans. 7 bears were killed during the operation. All of them were unusually large, and all of them had human DNA mixed in with their genetic material. The military scientists couldn't explain it, so they classified the entire incident and sealed the records. Mary and I were relocated to Anchorage for our own safety. She never talks about what happened in that church, but sometimes I catch her staring into the forest with a haunted look in her eyes. The doctors said she has no memory of the attack itself, which might be a blessing. I quit the Park Service and took a job with the Fish and Wildlife Department in town. Safer work, they said, with regular hours and no need to spend weeks alone in the wilderness. But they were wrong about it being safer. The bite marks on my arms from the fight healed strangely, Instead of normal scars, they left marks that look almost like tattoos. Dark lines that seem to move and shift when I'm not looking directly at them. And my senses have changed. I can smell things I never could before, track scents for miles, and hear conversations from impossible distances. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself dreaming about raw meat and the taste of blood. I wake up with dirt under my fingernails and no memory of how it got there. The hunger is always there now, lurking just below the surface, whispering suggestions about easy prey and dark feeding grounds. I think the curse affected me somehow during the fight. Not enough to make me like Ivan and his pack, but enough to change me in ways I'm still discovering. I have to fight the hunger every day, remind myself that I'm still human, still the man Mary married. But I also use these new abilities to help people. Every month, I get reports of strange animal attacks or missing hunters in remote areas. I investigate them quietly, looking for signs of the old curse. Because Ivan was right, there are others out there. Last week, I found evidence of a new pack operating near Katmai. 5 bears, working together with human-level intelligence, systematically hunting fishing camps just like Ivan's group had done. I managed to track them to their den and found human clothing arranged in ritual circles, bones carved with symbols I recognized from my grandmother's stories. I've started keeping records, coded in a way that only someone who knows the truth would understand. Future rangers and investigators will need to know what they're dealing with, even if they don't believe it at first. The silver bullets work, and so do blessed silver crosses. The curse can be fought, but it takes knowledge and preparation. Most importantly, it takes someone willing to believe that not all bears in Alaska are just bears. My grandmother's stories were all true. The Palraijuk are real, they're spreading, and they're getting smarter. They learn from each generation, adapting their hunting methods and recruitment techniques. What started with 7 starving men in 1889 has become something much larger and more dangerous. I still radio the old frequency every night at 6 o'clock, sending out coded warnings to any rangers or hunters who might be listening. Most people probably think it's just routine weather updates and wildlife observations. But for those who know what to listen for, the message is clear. Be careful out there. Trust your instincts and remember that some of the biggest predators in Alaska used to be human. The war isn't over. It might never be over. But as long as I'm still mostly human, I'll keep fighting. Because somewhere out there in the vast wilderness of Alaska, something is hunting people who venture too far from civilization. Something with human intelligence, bear strength, and an appetite that can never be satisfied. My name is Catherine Wolfhart, but everyone at the park calls me Storm. I've been a ranger at Denali for 12 years now, and in that time, I've pulled 73 climbers off this mountain when the weather tried to kill them. Mount McKinley doesn't play favorites. It'll freeze you solid whether you're a weekend warrior from Texas or an expert alpinist from Colorado. People ask me why I left my job as a meteorologist to come work in the middle of nowhere, Alaska. The truth is, weather and I have a complicated history. After my parents died in that plane crash when I was 8, my Athabascan grandmother raised me. She used to tell stories about the mountains having spirits, about things that lived in the wind and snow. I thought they were just stories until I started studying weather patterns in college and noticed things that didn't make sense in the textbooks. Now, I spend my days predicting storms and my nights reading pressure charts by lamplight. My cabin sits at the base of the North Face, 7,000 feet up, where only the serious climbers come. It's February 1976, and we're in the deep dark. 19 hours of night, and temperatures that'll freeze your breath before it leaves your mouth. The radio crackled to life at 0400 hours, jerking me out of sleep. Storm, you there? It was dispatch from headquarters, 200 miles south in Fairbanks. I'm here, Mike. What's going on? Got a situation with that climbing team that checked in 10 days ago. 8-person expedition registered for the West Buttress route. Their emergency beacon activated yesterday at 12,000 feet, but the signal's been moving around in ways that don't make sense. I sat up, suddenly wide awake. 10 days was too long, especially with the weather we'd been having. Moving around how? Signal jumps from 12,000 to 15,000 feet in minutes, then back down. GPS shows it covering ground that should take hours of climbing in just a few minutes. Could be equipment malfunction, but their last radio check mentioned strange weather patterns. I remembered the transmission. The team leader, a guy named Morrison from Seattle, had reported localized blizzards that appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as fast. I'd told him it was probably just microbursts from the mountain's thermal effects. Standard stuff. Right, Weather Service says conditions should be clear for the next 48 hours. We need someone to go up there and check it out. I was already pulling on my thermal layers. I'll take the ski plane up to base camp and start from there. If they're hurt, every hour counts. Storm, be careful up there. Some of the old-timers are saying the mountain's been acting strange this winter. More strange than usual. I almost laughed. The mountain was always strange. That's what made it deadly. I'll be fine, Mike. Been doing this for 12 years. But as I packed my gear in the pre-dawn darkness, my grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. She used to say that Denali wasn't just a mountain, it was a sleeping giant, and in the deepest winter, when the darkness was strongest, sometimes the giant would wake up hungry. I'd always figured she meant hungry for the lives of careless climbers. Now, loading my pack with enough food and gear for 10 days, I wondered if there might be more to those old stories than I'd thought. The wind outside my cabin was picking up, making a sound I'd never heard before, almost like voices, speaking words just too quiet to understand. The ski plane dropped me at base camp just after sunrise, though sunrise in February barely qualified as more than a gray smudge on the horizon. Pilot Jake gave me the usual warnings about weather coming in fast, promised to monitor radio frequencies, and flew off into the dim morning light. I stood alone at 7,200 feet, breathing air so thin it made my lungs work overtime. The silence was complete except for the wind, which seemed to be coming from all directions at once. That should have been my first clue that something was wrong. Morrison's team had left clear tracks, heading up the established route toward the west buttress. Standard procedure, good spacing between climbers, proper rope team formation. Everything looked normal until I reached their first camp at 9,500 feet. The tents were still standing, but they were arranged in a perfect spiral pattern pointing toward the summit. No climbing team sets up camp like that. You pitch tents based on wind protection and level ground, not geometry. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that all the tents were empty, but the sleeping bags were still warm. I keyed my radio. Dispatch, this is Storm. Found the team's first camp. Something's not right here. Static answered me. I tried again, adjusting frequencies, but got nothing. The radio had worked fine at base camp. Mountains could block signals, but I was on an exposed ridge with clear line of sight to the relay station. Inside the largest tent, I found Morrison's expedition log. The entries started normal enough: weather reports, team health checks, route planning. But the last few entries made my skin crawl. Asterisk. Day 6. Heard voices in the wind last night. Sarah thought it was another climbing team, but we're the only ones up here, according to the permit office. Asterisk. Asterisk. Day 7. Temperature dropped 40 degrees in 10 minutes. No weather system on our instruments. Jake says his GPS is showing elevation changes when we're not moving. Asterisk. Asterisk. Day 8. Found tracks around camp this morning. Human but wrong size. Footprints are 14 inches long and show 6 toes. Team getting spooked. Asterisk. Asterisk. Day 9. The voices are getting clearer. They're speaking Athabaskan. None of us speak Athabaskan. Asterisk. My grandmother's language. I spoke it fluently, learned it at her knee along with English. But how would climbers from Seattle know what language they were hearing? The final entry was just 2 words, written in shaky handwriting. It's calling. I backed out of the tent and immediately noticed something I'd missed before. There were indeed tracks around the camp, pressed deep into snow that should have been too frozen to take clear impressions. The prints were huge and showed an impossible number of toes, but that wasn't what made my hands shake as I photographed them. The tracks led up the mountain in a straight line, ignoring natural climbing routes, crevasse dangers, and avalanche zones. Whatever had made them could walk up a 70-degree ice wall like it was level ground. The wind picked up again, and this time I could definitely hear voices. They were speaking Athabaskan, just like Morrison had written, but the words they were saying made my blood turn cold. Asterisk, hungry, So hungry, come feed the mountain, asterisk. I grabbed my gear and started climbing, fast. The route to 10,000 feet should have taken me 4 hours. I made it in 2, driven by an urgency I couldn't explain. The voices in the wind kept getting clearer, and worse, they were starting to sound familiar. One of them sounded like my grandmother. At 10,000 feet, I found the team's second camp. Or, what was left of it. 3 tents had been shredded like tissue paper, but not by wind. The tiers were too regular, too precise. Something with claws had methodically destroyed them. Gear was scattered across a 100-yard radius, frozen solid and partially buried in snow. But there was still no sign of the climbing team. That's when I found the bones. They were arranged in a circle around what had been the camp's center, bleached white despite being fresh. Each bone had been stripped completely clean and showed teeth marks from something with fangs the size of my fingers. But the worst part was that they were human bones, and there were 8 sets of them. 8 climbers. 8 piles of bones. Except the bones were still warm, and when I touched one, it crumbled to dust. I ran. At 12,000 feet, my altimeter started going crazy. The needle swung wildly between 11 and 16,000 feet while I stood perfectly still. My GPS showed me moving in circles, even though I hadn't left the spot where I'd stopped to check equipment. The air felt wrong. Too thick for the altitude, and it tasted metallic, like blood. Aurora Borealis shouldn't be visible during daylight, but green and red lights were dancing across the northern sky, in patterns that hurt to look at directly. That's when I saw them. 8 figures standing on a ledge 500 feet above me, silhouetted against the impossible aurora. They were the right size and shape to be Morrison's climbing team, but they stood motionless in hurricane-force winds that should have knocked them off the mountain, and they were all facing me. "Hello," I shouted, my voice carrying strangely in the thin air. "Are you injured? Do you need help?" One of the figures raised its arm and waved. A normal, human gesture that should have been reassuring. But something about it was completely wrong. The movement was too fluid, too graceful for someone wearing heavy climbing gear in extreme cold. I started climbing toward them, following a route that should have been impossible in these conditions. The wind kept shifting, creating pockets of calm air that let me move faster than I'd ever moved at altitude before. It felt like the mountain was helping me reach them. That should have scared me more than it did. At 14,000 feet, the voices in the wind became a chorus. Dozens of them, all speaking Athabascan, all saying the same thing. Asterisk, come home, granddaughter, come feed with us. Asterisk, my grandmother's voice was the loudest. I found the climbing team at 15,000 feet, in a sheltered area that wasn't on any topographic map. They were all alive, sitting in a circle around a small fire that burned without fuel. When they looked up at me, their eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "Storm," Morrison called out, his voice cheerful and normal. "We've been waiting for you. Come sit with us. We're having dinner." The smell hit me then. Cooking meat, rich and savory, and so appealing it made my mouth water despite everything I'd seen. My stomach cramped with sudden, overwhelming hunger. "What are you cooking?" I heard myself ask, even though part of my mind was screaming at me to run. "Sarah brought extra provisions," Morrison said, gesturing to a woman I recognized from their permit photos. Except Sarah was also sitting in the circle, gnawing on what looked suspiciously like a human forearm. "Sarah's a good provider." The Sarah in the circle agreed, never stopping her methodical chewing. "We all take turns providing." That's when I noticed that each member of the team was missing a limb, arms, legs, chunks of torso, all neatly removed and partially healed over, like surgical amputations. But they were all still alive, still conscious, still eating. "It doesn't hurt," Morrison assured me, noticing my stare. "It feels good to feed the mountain. It feels good to feed each other. You look hungry, Storm. When's the last time you really ate?" I couldn't remember. The hunger was becoming overwhelming, a gnawing emptiness that made it hard to think about anything else. The meat they were sharing smelled so good, and they were all smiling at me with such genuine warmth. "Just a taste," suggested Sarah. "You've come so far, you must be starving." I took a step toward the circle, then another. The fire flared brighter, and in its light I could see that Morrison's team wasn't alone. There were dozens of other figures sitting just outside the circle, all in various stages of consumption and being consumed. Climbers from different decades, judging by their gear. all of them watching me with hungry, patient eyes. "That's it," Morrison encouraged. "Come join us. The mountain provides for everyone who knows how to feed it properly." My hand was reaching for the offered meat when I heard something that cut through the hunger like a knife. My grandmother's real voice, not the twisted echo in the wind, speaking words she'd taught me as a child. Asterisk. "When the Wechuj calls, turn away. It feeds on more than flesh." Asterisk. I jerked my hand back and stumbled away from the fire. The entire circle of climbers hissed in disappointment, and their faces began to change. Jaws elongating, teeth sharpening, skin stretching tight over bones that were growing and reshaping. "You can't leave," Morrison said, his voice deepening into an inhuman growl. "The mountain is hungry, we're all hungry, and you're the best meat we've smelled in years." Behind them all, something much larger began to rise from the shadows. Something that had been human once, a very long time ago, but was now 15 feet of emaciated limbs, translucent skin, and antlers like a diseased elk. The Wechuja, the cannibalistic giant from my grandmother's stories. It smiled at me with a mouth full of icicle teeth, and spoke in a voice like avalanches. Asterisk. "Welcome home, granddaughter." Asterisk. I ran blindly up the mountain, abandoning all climbing safety as the thing that had been Morrison's team howled behind me. The possessed climbers moved with inhuman speed, their transformed limbs carrying them over ice and rock like they were running on level ground. But the Wechuj itself was faster. It flowed up the mountain beside me, sometimes solid, sometimes seeming to be made of wind and snow. When it was solid, I could see the horrible details. Skin so translucent I could see its frozen organs, eyes like black ice, and that mouth that never stopped smiling. Asterisk. "You cannot escape what you are." Asterisk. It called to me in my grandmother's voice. Asterisk. "Your bloodline called me here. Your people created me." Asterisk. I reached the false summit at 19,000 feet with my lungs burning and my vision graying from lack of oxygen. There was nowhere higher to run. The true summit was 1,000 feet of technical climbing away. Impossible without proper equipment and planning. The aurora borealis exploded across the sky like the mountain was bleeding light. In its glow, I could see the truth spread out below me. The entire north face was covered with the possessed. Decades of missing climbers, all transformed into feeding drones for the ancient thing that stood before me. Asterisk. "Do you know what I was?" Asterisk. The Wechuj asked, circling me slowly. Asterisk. "I was a shaman, a healer. I kept my people alive during the worst winter in memory. But the snow kept falling, and the games stopped coming, and the children started dying." Asterisk. The creature's voice was hypnotic, and I found myself unable to move as it spoke. Asterisk. "One child died, then another. I had a choice, let my people starve, or break the greatest taboo. So I fed them the only meat left. I fed them each other. And when the winter ended, and my people saw what I had made them do, they cursed me to hunger forever." Asterisk. 1. "That was 300 years ago," I managed to say. "You should be dead." Asterisk. "Death is for those who stay human." I became something else, something that feeds not just on flesh, but on the act of feeding. Every person who breaks the taboo, who chooses survival over humanity, feeds me, makes me stronger. Asterisk. The wind around us was reaching hurricane strength, but the Wechuji stood unmoved. Ice crystals formed in the air and began to take shape, spears, clubs, blades made of frozen water sharp enough to cut through steel. Asterisk. Your grandmother knew what I was. Her bloodline has guarded against me for generations. But you left the old ways behind. You chose science over spirit. You made yourself vulnerable. Asterisk. It was right. I'd rejected my grandmother's stories, dismissed them as primitive superstition. I'd thought understanding weather patterns and atmospheric pressure made me immune to the old fears. But as the creature raised its ice weapons, I remembered something else my grandmother had taught me. Not a story, but a song. A protection chant she'd made me memorize, claiming it would keep me safe from things that hunt in the darkness. Asterisk. Too late for prayers, granddaughter. Asterisk. The ice spears flew toward me with the speed of bullets. I dove aside, pulling something from my emergency pack, not a weapon, but a small pouch of sacred tobacco my grandmother had given me years ago. I'd carried it as a sentimental keepsake, never believing I'd need it. The aurora blazed brighter, And I remembered her words. Asterisk. When the lights dance strongest, the spirits listen closest. Asterisk. I lit the tobacco with my emergency flare and began to sing. The effect was immediate. The Wet'suge shrieked and staggered backward, its translucent skin beginning to smoke and steam. The possessed climbers below howled in pain and confusion, their transformations reversing. Asterisk. Impossible. You turned away from the old ways. Asterisk. I turned away. I gasped, continuing the chant while the sacred smoke swirled around us. But they never turned away from me. The creature lunged forward, growing to 20 feet tall, its antlers scraping the sky. But the smoke formed a barrier it couldn't cross. Every time it tried to reach me, the protection chant drove it back. The aurora reached its peak intensity, and suddenly I wasn't alone on the summit. Translucent figures stood with me, my grandmother, her grandmother before her, generations of women who had held the line against the hunger in the darkness. Together, we sang the Wet'suge back into the mountain, back into the deep places where it belonged. The creature's final scream shattered ice formations across the entire north face, and then it was gone. The possessed climbers collapsed in the snow below, human again but broken by their experiences. Some of them would survive, some would them. But the mountain was quiet. The military helicopter found me 18 hours later, half frozen and barely conscious at the false summit. They said it was a miracle I'd survived the night at that altitude without shelter. They said the aurora activity had been the strongest on record, causing electromagnetic interference that explained the radio problems and GPS failures. They said a lot of things that made sense and fit into neat reports. Morrison's team was evacuated to Anchorage General. 3 died from exposure and altitude sickness. The survivors had complete amnesia about everything after their second day on the mountain. The doctors called it trauma-induced memory loss, a psychological defense against some kind of shared psychotic episode brought on by extreme conditions. The official report listed it as a standard mountaineering accident complicated by unprecedented weather phenomena. I knew better. Back at my cabin, I spread my grandmother's things across the kitchen table, items I'd kept but never really understood. Sacred bundles, protection charms, maps of the mountain drawn in symbols instead of elevation lines. For the first time, I tried to read them with eyes opened by experience. The maps showed the Wet'suge's territory, marked with warnings in Athabascan that I'd never bothered to translate. The boundaries shifted with the seasons and the strength of the aurora, but they were always there, a hunting ground that stretched from the base camps to the summit, wherever the winter darkness was deepest and the human spirit was most vulnerable. My grandmother had been part of a long line of guardians, women who kept watch and warned people away during the dangerous seasons. She'd tried to teach me, but I'd been too interested in barometric pressure and wind patterns to listen to stories about hungry spirits. Now I understood that they were the same thing. I started keeping different kinds of records after that. Along with temperature readings and weather predictions, I tracked aurora activity, noted when climbers reported strange experiences, and learned to recognize the signs that the mountain was waking up hungry. 3 months later, a solo climber from Germany reported hearing voices in an unknown language during a spring ascent. I met him at base camp and convinced him to turn back, told him about unstable snow conditions and avalanche danger. He was annoyed, but alive. 2 weeks after that, a climbing team from Japan found their camp rearranged in patterns they didn't remember making. I guided them off the mountain, personally, claimed there was a storm coming that didn't show up on any weather service. The Wet'suge was still there, still hunting, still hungry, but it was contained, held in check by old protections I was finally learning to maintain. Every winter, when the darkness is longest and the aurora dances brightest, I can feel it stirring, testing the boundaries, calling to climbers in languages they don't understand, offering warmth and food and companionship to anyone desperate enough to listen. And every winter, I'm here to turn them away. My name is Catherine Wolfhart, but everyone calls me Storm. I've been a ranger at Denali for 12 years, and I've learned that some storms can't be predicted by scientific instruments. Some storms have teeth and ancient hunger, and they've been waiting in the mountains longer than we've had words to name them. The mountain keeps its secrets, but so do I. And when the wind speaks Athabascan in the deepest darkness of winter, I know exactly what it's saying. It's saying it's still hungry, but I'm still listening. My name is Vincent Ashwood, but everyone at Katmai calls me Bear Track. I've been a ranger here for 18 years, and in that time, I've tracked over 300 individual brown bears. I can tell you which bear made which print just by looking at the shape of their claws in the mud. I can predict where they'll fish by watching the salmon runs. I thought I knew everything about these animals. I was wrong. It's October 1981, and I'm sitting in my cabin in the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, writing this down while I still remember it clearly. The volcanic landscape outside my window looks peaceful now, just steam rising from the fumaroles like morning coffee breath. But 3 days ago, this place was hell on earth. Not because of the volcano. I've lived through eruptions before. Because of what was living inside the bears. Let me back up. I'm 41, been doing this job since I got back from Vietnam in '63. The Army taught me how to track men through jungle that wanted to kill me. Alaska taught me how to track animals through wilderness that definitely wants to kill me. My Yupik stepfather, Samuel, taught me the old ways, how to read the land like a book, how to move without disturbing the spirits. I never believed in the spirits part. If something had claws and fangs, it was just another predator to respect and avoid. Samuel used to tell stories about Unyarak shadow spirits that could get inside bears during volcanic eruptions. I figured it was just his way of explaining why bears got more aggressive when the mountains started smoking. The Valley of 10,000 Smokes earned its name after the 1912 eruption of Novarupta. 40 square miles of volcanic wasteland where steam still rises from thousands of cracks in the earth. It's beautiful in a deadly way, like walking on the surface of an alien world. The sulfur smell gets to you after a while, makes your eyes water and your throat burn. But it's perfect country for photography, which is why people keep coming here despite the danger. 4 photographers had been missing for 8 days when headquarters radioed me. The team was led by Marcus Webb, a National Geographic photographer who specialized in wildlife shots. He had 3 assistants with him, Sarah Chen, David Kowalski, and Michael Turner, all experienced outdoors people, all carrying emergency beacons that had gone silent on the same day. I found their base camp on the morning of October 15th. Everything was still there: expensive camera equipment, food supplies, sleeping bags laid out like they'd just stepped away for a moment. But there were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no scattered gear, just emptiness and the smell of sulfur on the wind. The thing that bothered me most was the camera equipment. These were professional photographers with thousands of dollars worth of gear, and they'd left it all behind. Marcus Webb would sleep with his cameras before he'd abandon them. Something had made them leave in a hurry, but not the kind of hurry that comes from bears or weather. This was different. I started tracking from the camp perimeter. The photographers had been following the salmon run up Yukok River, taking pictures of bears fishing in the rapids. Normal behavior for both the humans and the animals. But the tracks I found weren't normal at all. Bear tracks usually tell a story. They wander, following scent trails or food sources. They show where an animal stopped to investigate something interesting, where it scratched a tree or rolled in the dirt. These tracks were different. They moved in perfectly straight lines, like someone had drawn them with a ruler. No wandering, no sniffing around, no natural bear behavior at all. I followed the tracks for 2 miles before I started feeling watched. The feeling started as a tickle between my shoulder blades, the kind you get when someone's staring at you from across a room. But there was no one around for 50 miles except me and whatever had happened to the photographers. I stopped and listened. The valley is never completely quiet. There's always steam hissing from the vents, wind whistling through the rocks, the distant sound of water running underground. But something was wrong with the sounds today. They seemed muffled, like someone had thrown a blanket over the whole landscape. I pulled out my binoculars and scanned the ridgeline. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then, movement caught my eye, a large brown bear standing on a ridge about 400 yards away. It wasn't moving, wasn't feeding, just standing there looking in my direction. Bears don't do that. When they notice humans, they either run away or come closer to investigate. They don't stand perfectly still and stare. This one looked like a statue carved from brown stone. I watched it for 5 minutes. It never moved. Never shifted weight, never turned its head, never even seemed to breathe. Finally, I looked away to check my compass, and when I looked back, it was gone. The tracks led deeper into the thermal field, where the ground gets unstable and the sulfur smell becomes strong enough to make you dizzy. I should have turned back, Protocol says never enter active thermal areas alone, especially when visibility is poor from volcanic gases. But those photographers were out here somewhere, and I was the only one who could find them. The tracks started getting weird around noon. I'm talking about impossible weird. The normal bear tracks would suddenly stop, and 20 feet away, they'd start again. Like the animal had jumped an impossible distance, or just stopped existing for a while. I found places where the tracks showed a bear had walked straight up a vertical rock face. Other places where the prints were burned into solid stone, as if the bear's feet were red hot. I started taking pictures with my emergency camera. The film came back later, showing things my eyes hadn't seen at the time. In one shot of normal-looking bear tracks, the developed photo showed a second set of tracks overlapping the first ones. Shadow tracks, like something invisible had been walking alongside the bear. The thermal readings on my equipment started going crazy around 2 o'clock. My portable thermometer showed hot spots moving around independently of the thermal vents. Cold spots too, patches of ground that registered 20 degrees below the surrounding temperature, for no reason I could understand. That's when I found the first camera. It was Marcus Webb's primary camera, a professional Nikon that probably cost more than my truck. It was sitting on a flat rock in the middle of a thermal field, perfectly positioned like someone had set up a shot. The camera was undamaged, but the film inside had been exposed to something that turned it completely black. Except for the last 3 frames. Those frames showed pictures that Marcus couldn't have taken. They were shots of the photography team, but taken from impossible angles high above their heads, as if something had been floating in the air watching them. In the final frame, you could see fear on their faces as they looked up at whatever was holding the camera. Behind them, in that last photo, barely visible in the shadows, were shapes that looked like bears. But the shadows these bears cast didn't match their bodies. The shadows were larger, more angular, and seemed to be reaching toward the humans with arms instead of legs. I was studying the photographs when I heard the sound. It started low, like a diesel engine idling in the distance. But it was coming from multiple directions at once, getting closer. I'd heard bears make a lot of sounds in my 18 years, huffing, woofing, clicking their teeth when they're nervous. This wasn't any sound a bear should make. I grabbed my rifle and bear spray and backed toward higher ground. The sound kept getting closer, but I couldn't see what was making it. Then the sulfur smell got stronger, and the temperature dropped about 10 degrees in 30 seconds. Something moved in my peripheral vision. I spun around and saw a brown bear about 60 yards away, standing in a patch of clear ground between 2 thermal vents. Normal size, normal coloring, normal in every way except for its shadow. The bear's shadow was moving independently. While the animal stood still, its shadow was pacing back and forth like a caged predator. The shadow was also wrong-shaped, too tall, with arms that reached too far, and a head that was the wrong size. I blinked hard, thinking the sulfur gases were making me hallucinate. When I opened my eyes, both the bear and its impossible shadow were gone. But in the dust where they'd been standing, I found 2 sets of tracks. Normal bear prints, and beside them, prints that looked like they'd been burned into the ground by something much hotter than any living animal should be. The radio crackled to life on my belt. Static mostly, but underneath it, I could swear I heard voices calling for help. The voices on the radio were definitely human, but they faded in and out like a distant station during a storm. I tried to respond, but only got static back. The electromagnetic interference from volcanic activity plays hell with communications, but this felt different. The voices sounded like they were coming from underground. I followed the strange tracks for another mile, and the landscape started changing in ways that made my skin crawl. The thermal vents were arranging themselves in patterns that looked almost geometric, perfect circles and straight lines that nature doesn't usually create. Steam was rising in columns that bent at 90-degree angles, defying physics. My stepfather Samuel's voice echoed in my memory. When the mountains bleed fire, the hungry shadows wake up. They've been sleeping under the earth since the last big eruption, waiting for their chance to walk again. I'd thought it was just folklore. Now, I was starting to wonder. Around 4 o'clock, I found the second camera. This one belonged to Sarah Chen, and it was hanging from a tree branch, about 12 feet off the ground. No human had put it there. The bark showed claw marks, but they were burned into the wood like brands. The film in this camera was mostly intact. The pictures showed the progression of the team's last day, starting with normal wildlife shots of bears fishing in the river. But as the day went on, the photos got stranger. Bears that appeared in multiple places in the same shot. Bears whose eyes glowed white in the afternoon sunlight. Bears that cast no shadows at all. The final photos showed something that made my blood turn cold. The team had been photographing a group of 6 bears near a thermal pool. Normal behavior, normal setting. But in the background of every shot, more bears kept appearing. By the last photo, there were at least 20 bears surrounding the humans in a perfect circle. Bears don't hunt in packs like wolves. They're solitary animals except during mating season and when mothers have cubs. These bears were hunting like they had a plan. I was studying the photos when I heard David Kowalski screaming. The sound came from somewhere ahead of me, deeper in the thermal field. It was definitely human, definitely terrified, and definitely real. I grabbed my gear and started running toward the sound, jumping over steaming cracks in the earth and dodging unstable ground that could collapse into superheated mud at any moment. The screaming stopped just as I reached a ridge overlooking a natural amphitheater formed by ancient lava flows. Below me was a thermal cave, one of the deep ones that honeycomb this whole area. Steam was rising from the entrance, and I could see artificial light flickering inside. I also saw bears. Lots of them. At least 15 brown bears were arranged in a semicircle around the cave entrance. They weren't moving, weren't making any sound, just sitting there like they were waiting for something. Behind them, their shadows writhed and twisted independently, reaching toward the cave with grasping arms. The bears themselves looked normal. Their shadows looked hungry. I set up my binoculars and tried to see inside the cave. The artificial light was coming from camera flashes. Someone was still alive down there, still taking pictures. But the flashes were irregular, desperate. Like someone was using the camera flash as a weapon against something that didn't like bright light. That's when I realized the bears weren't guarding the cave to keep the humans in. They were guarding it to keep something else out. Or to keep something else in. I worked my way down the ridge as quietly as possible. 18 years of tracking experience told me how to move without being detected, even by animals with better senses than mine. But these bears were different. As I got closer, I could see that their eyes weren't focusing on anything in the physical world. They were staring at something I couldn't see. Something that existed in the same space, but not the same dimension. 50 yards from the cave, I found Michael Turner. He was alive, barely. Lying behind a boulder, unconscious but breathing. His skin was pale and cold, despite the thermal heat from the ground around us. When I checked his pulse, it was weak and irregular, like his heart was forgetting how to beat. But the strangest thing was his shadow. Michael's body was lying still, but his shadow was struggling, twisting back and forth like it was trying to break free from his body. I could actually see the shadow pulling away from him, stretching toward the cave like it was being drawn by some invisible force. I tried to wake him up, but his eyes opened without focusing on anything. He looked right through me and whispered, "They're eating the light. They're eating everything that makes us warm." Then his shadow snapped back to his body like a rubber band, and he screamed. The sound echoed off the rocks, and all 15 bears turned to look at me at once. Not at the sound, not at the movement directly at me, like they'd known I was there all along and were just waiting for the right moment to acknowledge it. Their shadows began moving toward me while their bodies stayed perfectly still. I grabbed Michael under the arms and started dragging him away from the cave, but something was wrong with his body weight. He felt hollow, like most of his substance had been drained away. His shadow kept trying to stretch back toward the cave, and I could feel it pulling against me like a living thing. The bears began moving then, but not like any bears I'd ever seen. They moved in perfect synchronization, turning as one unit and advancing in a coordinated formation that would have impressed any military unit. Their shadows moved ahead of them, flowing across the ground like spilled oil. I managed to get Michael behind a large boulder and tried the radio again. This time, I got through to headquarters, but the connection was full of static and interference. "Base, this is Ashwood. I've found one of the photographers. Need immediate evacuation? Thermal cave area. Coordinates?" A voice cut through the static, but it wasn't from headquarters. It was Marcus Webb's voice, coming from somewhere inside the cave. "Vincent, don't trust the radio. They can use our voices. They can use anything we've touched." The bears were 30 yards away now, close enough that I could see their eyes. They weren't the normal dark brown of bear eyes. They were white, like cataracts. but with something moving underneath the surface. Something that looked like smoke trapped under ice. I pulled out my bear spray, knowing it probably wouldn't work, but having to try something. The first bear got within range, and I let it have a full blast of pepper spray directly in the face. The spray passed right through its head like the bear was made of mist. That's when I understood what Samuel had been trying to tell me all those years. These weren't bears anymore. They were something else, wearing bear shapes, something that had crawled up from the deep volcanic chambers where it had been waiting since the last major eruption. The volcanic spirits, the Ungnarak, were real. They fed on life force, on the warmth that makes living things different from rocks and ice. They could possess animals during periods of high volcanic activity, using their bodies as vehicles to hunt for the energy they needed to survive. And they were very, very hungry after sleeping for 70 years. Michael stirred in my arms and pointed toward the cave with a shaking hand. Sarah and David are still alive, but not for long. The shadows are eating them slowly, keeping them fresh. I looked at the cave entrance and saw camera flashes going off in irregular patterns. Someone was still fighting down there, still trying to document what was happening, even as they were being slowly consumed by creatures that shouldn't exist. That's when the guilt hit me. The same guilt I'd carried since Vietnam, when I'd survived missions that killed better men than me. I couldn't run away and let 3 more people die because I was too scared to act. I helped Michael to a more stable position and checked my equipment. 1 rifle with 8 rounds, 1 canister of bear spray that was useless against these things, 1 emergency flare, and 1 container of traditional tobacco that Samuel had given me years ago for spiritual protection. The tobacco. Samuel had always insisted that certain plants could drive away evil spirits. I'd thought it was superstition, but then again, I'd thought shadow spirits were superstition too. The bears had stopped advancing. They formed a circle around me and Michael, close enough to attack but staying just out of reach, waiting for something. Then I saw what they were waiting for. The shadows detached completely from their host bodies. 15 bear-shaped shadows rose up from the ground like smoke, growing larger and more defined as they separated from the physical animals. The real bears collapsed where they stood, dead or unconscious. The shadow beings towered over them, 8 feet tall and growing, with arms that ended in claws and faces that were holes in the world. One of them spoke, using Marcus Webb's voice. "You cannot help them, Ranger, but you can join them. Your pain makes you easy to take, your guilt makes you delicious." It was right about the guilt. I could feel it pulling at something inside me, trying to draw out the warmth and life that kept me moving. The same way it had been slowly draining the photographers. But guilt had also taught me something about sacrifice. I lit Samuel's tobacco with a match and blew the smoke toward the nearest shadow. It recoiled like I'd hit it with acid, its form wavering and shrinking. The other shadows hesitated, giving me the opening I needed. I ran for the cave. The cave was deeper than I'd expected, leading down into natural chambers carved by ancient thermal activity. The air was thick with steam and sulfur, but underneath it was something else, the smell of ice, even though the temperature was over 90 degrees. I found them in the deepest chamber, and they were still alive. Marcus Webb was sitting against the cave wall, methodically taking flash photos of the shadows that kept trying to creep closer. Sarah Chen was unconscious, but breathing. David Kowalski was awake, but staring at nothing, his lips moving in constant whispered conversation with something I couldn't see. "About time," Marcus said when he saw me. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "Been fighting these things for 3 days. Flash photography seems to hurt them, but my batteries are almost dead." The shadows filled the chamber, flowing around us like a dark tide, but they stopped just short of the circle of light created by Marcus's camera flash. I could see them more clearly now, not just bear shapes, but human shapes too, and things that had never been alive at all. The shadow of the volcano itself, hungry and ancient and patient. I pulled out what was left of Samuel's tobacco and lit it. The smoke created a barrier that the shadows couldn't cross. In the breathing room this gave us, I helped Sarah and David to their feet and started moving everyone toward the cave entrance. We almost made it. The shadows followed us, staying just outside the range of the protective smoke but getting bolder as my supply of tobacco ran low. At the cave entrance, they made their final attack, surging forward in a wave of hungry darkness. That's when the volcano saved us. A real tremor shook the ground. followed by a genuine eruption, not a major one, but big enough to send a column of ash and gases high into the air. The electromagnetic pulse from the eruption disrupted whatever energy the shadows used to maintain their forms. They wavered, stretched thin, and then snapped back toward the deep volcanic vents like they were being pulled home by an invisible force. The possessed bears woke up, looked around in confusion, and wandered off like nothing had happened. The bush pilot who evacuated us 3 hours later found 4 people with severe hypothermia and dehydration, plus 1 ranger with a story nobody would believe. The official report listed the incident as volcanic gas exposure, causing temporary disorientation and hallucinations. That was 6 months ago. I'm still a ranger at Katmai, still tracking bears and monitoring volcanic activity. But now I pay attention to different things. I watch for shadows that don't match their owners. I listen for sounds that don't belong. I carry tobacco and other things Samuel taught me about, just in case. Because the shadows are still down there, sleeping in the deep places where the earth bleeds fire. They're patient. They can wait another 70 years if they have to, wait for the next major eruption to wake them up and give them another chance to feed. When that day comes, I'll be ready for them. Or maybe I'll be one of them by then, another voice calling for help on a radio that no one should answer. Either way, someone needs to keep watch. Someone needs to remember that there are things in this world that are older and hungrier than we like to admit. Things that see our warm, bright lives as nothing more than food. My name is Vincent Ashwood, and I've been tracking the shadows for 6 months now. They're starting to track me back. My name is Margaret Ravenclaw, but everyone calls me Ice. I've been a ranger in the Chugach National Forest for 14 years, and in that time, I've saved 89 lives. I know that number because I keep track. When you work emergency medicine in the wilderness, every life matters. Every person you bring home alive is a victory against the cold, the distance, and the things that want to kill you out here. I'm also a paramedic, not just the basic wilderness first aid that most rangers learn, but the real deal. I can intubate, start IVs, perform emergency surgery with nothing but a headlamp and whatever's in my kit. I learned it the hard way, back when I was 22 and got caught in an avalanche near Portage Glacier. Buried for 3 days under 10 feet of snow and ice. Should have died. Would have died, except something happened down there in the dark that I still don't understand. My mother always said it was the old healing ways. She's Tlingit, raised me to know both worlds, the hospital where she worked as a nurse, and the traditional medicine she learned from her grandmother. I never believed the spiritual stuff. Figured the herbal remedies worked because of chemistry, not magic. The healing ceremonies helped people feel better because the mind affects the body. Simple as that. But 3 days under that avalanche changed something in me. When they finally dug me out, I wasn't just alive, I was stronger. Could work in cold that would drop other people, could find injuries just by touching someone, know exactly what was wrong before any tests. The doctors called it heightened senses from trauma. I figured they were probably right. November in Alaska means winter's coming fast. By 1988, we only got 8 hours of real daylight, and the temperature was already hitting -25 at night. Ice season. The most dangerous time of year. Glaciers shift and crack, making new crevasses overnight. Sea ice forms and breaks up without warning. Even the wildlife gets desperate, taking risks they wouldn't normally take. This far out in the Chugach, we're 75 miles from Anchorage, no roads. If something goes wrong, you call for a helicopter and pray the weather's good enough to fly. If it's not, you survive on what you've got until it clears. I keep supplies for 3 weeks, just in case. The call came in on November 15th, just before dawn. Dr. Sarah Chen's research team had been studying glacier recession near Prince William Sound, climate change work, measuring how fast the ice was disappearing. They'd been up there 5 days and missed their scheduled check-in by 2 full days. Their emergency beacon's still transmitting, the dispatcher told me. But it's moving. Signals coming from different spots along the glacier face. I grabbed my medical gear and headed for the helicopter pad. Whatever was happening up there, I'd bet someone was hurt. In my experience, when research teams go quiet, it usually means hypothermia, falls, or equipment failure. All things I could handle, What I couldn't handle, what I wasn't ready for, was something my mother's stories had warned me about since I was little. The Kushtaka. Shapeshifters that lived in the glaciers, creatures that could heal any wound but demanded terrible payment. Stories to scare children, I'd always thought. Just another way the old people explained things they didn't understand. I should have listened to those stories more carefully. The helicopter dropped me at the research camp at 0800 hours. The pilot, Jake Morrison, 20 years experience flying these mountains, looked nervous. "Weather's closing in from the south," he shouted over the rotor noise. "I can give you 6 hours max. Then I have to get out of here, whether you're ready or not." I waved him off and shouldered my medical pack. The camp looked wrong from the start. 3 tents, all set up properly, but arranged in a perfect circle around a pile of equipment. Not the way you'd normally organize a base camp. You'd want your tents close together for warmth, not spread out like points on a compass. The emergency beacon was still beeping, but the sound was coming from inside the equipment pile. I dug through sleeping bags, cooking gear, and scientific instruments until I found it. A standard GPS emergency locator, the kind that sends your position to search and rescue. Except according to my handheld GPS, this beacon had been in 4 different locations in the last hour. Locations that were 2 miles apart. Impossible. These things don't move unless someone carries them. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Ranger Ravenclaw at the Chen research site. I have their emergency beacon, but no sign of the team. Beginning search now." Static answered me. "Too much ice in the air, probably. Or the mountains blocking the signal. Standard problems out here." The first tent was Dr. Chen's. I unzipped the fly and crawled inside. Her equipment was still there. Laptop, research notes, personal items, but her sleeping bag had been sliced open. The insulation scattered everywhere. Not torn, sliced, clean cuts, like someone had used a very sharp knife to gut it from the inside out. Blood spots on the tent floor. Not much, but enough to tell me someone had been hurt. I pulled out my medical kit and tested a sample with a field hemoglobin kit. Human blood, but something was off about it. The cellular structure looked strange under my portable microscope. Too regular, like it had been artificially oxygenated. The second tent belonged to Dr. Marcus Webb, the team's glaciologist. Same story, equipment intact, sleeping bag destroyed, blood on the floor. But this time there was something else. Tracks in the frost on the tent floor. Not boot prints. These were long and narrow, with what looked like webbing between the toes. Like an otter's feet, but sized for something much larger. I photographed everything, then moved to the third tent. Dr. Lisa Park, the team's medical researcher. This one was different. Her tent was still zipped shut, but when I opened it, the smell hit me immediately. Fish. Not rotting fish, but fresh, like someone had just cleaned a salmon inside the tent. Lisa's sleeping bag was intact, but it was soaked with water. Ice-cold glacier water. Her medical kit was scattered around the tent, but arranged in a pattern I recognized from my mother's traditional healing ceremonies. Syringes laid out like spokes on a wheel. Bandages folded into specific shapes. Medications arranged by color and dosage. Someone had been performing medical procedures in here, recently. I backed out of the tent and checked my watch. 2 hours until the helicopter would start getting nervous about the weather. I needed to find these people. The tracks led from the third tent toward the glacier. Clear prints in the snow, 2 sets of boots walking normally, then joined by something else. The webbed prints I'd seen in the tent, all 3 sets of tracks headed directly for the ice wall. I followed them. The glacier rose about 60 feet above the research site, blue-white ice carved into impossible shapes by wind and pressure. Crevasses opened like wounds in the surface, some narrow enough to step across, others wide enough to swallow a truck. The tracks led to one of the smaller crevasses, maybe 4 feet wide. I clipped into my climbing gear and rappelled down. 20 feet into the ice. The crevasse opened into a cavity. A cave carved by meltwater, walls smooth as glass. And in that cave, I found Dr. Chen. She was alive, sitting against the ice wall, eyes open, breathing normally. But when I called her name, she didn't respond. I checked her pulse, steady, strong, but too slow. Hypothermia? Maybe. Or shock. "Dr. Chen? Sarah? Can you hear me?" Her eyes focused on me, and she smiled. A normal smile, except for one thing. Her teeth had changed. They were pointed now, sharp like a fish eater's teeth. and when she opened her mouth to speak, I could see gills fluttering along the sides of her neck. "The healing is almost complete," she said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. "Soon, we'll be able to help everyone." I reached for my medical kit, but she grabbed my wrist. Her hand was ice cold and wet, but her grip was stronger than any human's should be. And I could feel something else. A pulse in her wrist that wasn't a heartbeat. It was too fast, too regular, like the rhythm of something breathing underwater. "You're the one they sent," she said. "The healer. We've been waiting for you." I jerked my hand free and backed away, my headlamp beam dancing across the ice walls. Dr. Chen, or what looked like Dr. Chen, remained sitting against the wall, still smiling with those sharp teeth. "Where are the others?" I demanded, pulling out my radio. "Nothing but static." "They're healing too," she said. "Dr. Webb is in the deep chamber, learning to breathe water. Dr. Park is almost ready for the transformation. Her medical knowledge will be so useful. I've seen hypothermia psychosis before. People say strange things when their brain temperature drops. But this was different. Chen's body temperature felt normal under my medical scanner. Her pulse was steady. Her oxygen saturation was actually higher than normal, not lower like you'd expect with hypothermia. "Sarah, I'm going to help you, but I need you to tell me what happened. Where did the blood in your tent come from?" She tilted her head, studying me. "The Kushtaka came to us on the second night. It smelled the sickness in Dr. Park, the cancer growing in her lungs. It wanted to help." My blood went cold. Dr. Park's medical file hadn't mentioned cancer. But if someone could smell disease, it offered to heal all of us, Chen continued. To give us bodies that could survive anything. No more hypothermia, no more drowning, no more death from the things that live in the ice. I backed toward the crevasse opening. "I'm going to get help, real medical help." "You can't leave," Chen said. "It's already started with you." That's when I noticed the water. Ice-cold glacier water was seeping up through cracks in the floor, rising around my boots. But glacier cavities don't flood like this. The water had to be coming from somewhere else. Somewhere connected to the glacier's deeper systems. I climbed as fast as I could, hauling myself up the ice walls. Behind me, I could hear Chen laughing. Not a human laugh. More like the sound a seal makes when it calls to its pod. At the surface, I ran back toward the research camp. I had maybe 3 hours before the helicopter would leave with or without me. Time enough to search for the other 2 team members and call for backup medical evacuation. But the camp had changed while I was underground. The tents were gone, all of them. The equipment pile had been reorganized into a perfect spiral pattern, with medical instruments at the center, IV tubes, syringes, surgical tools, all arranged like an operating room. An operating room built on glacier ice. My radio crackled to life. "Ice, this is Morrison. Weather's getting bad fast. I need to pull you out in 2 hours, not 6. I keyed the mic. "Jake, I need medical evacuation for 3 people. Possible hypothermia, definitely altered mental state. And Jake, bring backup. Bring lots of backup. Static, then, ice, did you say 3 people? Because my instruments show 5 heat signatures at your location. 5 people moving around down there." I spun around, scanning the area. I could see my own tracks, Chen's tracks leading to the crevasse, the strange webbed prints. But now there were others. Fresh tracks in the snow, leading from the glacier toward a deeper crevasse system I hadn't noticed before. I followed them. Had to. If Webb and Park were still alive, they needed medical attention. The tracks led to another crevasse, this one wider and deeper. I could see light coming from somewhere below, not artificial light, but a strange blue-green glow like bioluminescence. Rappelling down, I found a cavern much larger than the first. The walls were covered in ice formations that looked almost organic, like blood vessels or nerve networks frozen in blue ice, and the light was coming from the ice itself, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. Dr. Webb was there, suspended in a pool of glacier water. He was breathing it. I could see his chest rising and falling as the water flowed in and out of his lungs. His skin had taken on a gray-blue color, and fins were growing along his arms and spine. Dr. Park sat beside the pool, very much alive but changed. The cancer I'd somehow known about was gone. I could tell just by looking at her. But in its place, she'd grown a second set of arms, smaller than the original, but perfectly functional. She was using all 4 hands to arrange medical instruments around the pool's edge. Margaret, she said without looking up. We wondered when you'd find us. Are you ready for your treatment? Lisa, what happened to you? What happened to Marcus? She finally looked at me, and her eyes had gone completely black. Not the pupils, the entire eye, like a seal's. The Kushtaka healed us. It cured my cancer, made Marcus able to survive underwater indefinitely, and now it wants to heal you too. I'm not sick. Everyone's sick, she said. Everyone dies, but the Kushtaka can fix that. The thing in the water, Marcus, raised its head and spoke in bubbles and clicks. Park translated, he says you have the healing gift already. That's why you survived the avalanche. The Kushtaka has been watching you for years, waiting for the right time to offer its partnership. Partnership, not healing, not help, partnership. What does it want in exchange? Park smiled with teeth that were too sharp. It wants to learn human medicine. Our surgical techniques, our drugs, our knowledge of anatomy. In exchange, it teaches us how to heal anything. Cancer, age, death itself. That's when I understood. The Kushtaka wasn't trying to help people. It was experimenting on them. Learning from them. Using human medical knowledge to perfect its own transformation process. And I was next. The water in the pool began to rise. Not overflow, rise straight up, defying gravity, forming a column of liquid ice that sparkled with that blue-green light. And in the center of the column, something took shape. 8 feet tall, humanoid but wrong, sleek gray-brown fur covering powerful muscles, hands that could phase between solid and liquid, fingers ending in claws designed for both surgery and killing. Its face was a mixture of otter and human, with eyes that held intelligence older than the glaciers themselves. The Kushtaka. Healer, it spoke in a voice like water over stones. You have come to join the great work. I backed toward the crevasse opening, but the ice walls had somehow grown together. Sealed. The only way out was through the creature. The great work? Perfecting life? It said, your people have learned to cut and repair, to poison disease and force the body to heal. But you still die. We have learned to reshape life itself, to make bodies that cannot fail. Together, we will eliminate death. Dr. Park nodded enthusiastically. Think about it, Margaret. No more losing patients to hypothermia. No more watching people die from trauma we can't fix in the field. Perfect bodies that can survive anything. I looked at Marcus in the pool, breathing water but no longer human. At Lisa, with her extra arms and black eyes. At the Kushtaka, with its surgical claws and predator's smile. What about choice? I asked. What about consent? Irrelevant, the Kushtaka said. The sick do not choose to be healed, they are healed. The dying do not choose to live, they are given life. It extended one clawed hand toward me. You will be my greatest student. Your medical knowledge, combined with my abilities, will allow us to heal anyone, transform anyone. We will spread this gift to every human on Earth. The water began to rise around my feet. Ice cold and somehow alive. I could feel it trying to get into my lungs through my skin. The Kushtaka's transformation fluid. I thought about my mother's traditional healing ceremonies, how she always said the old medicine worked through balance, through giving and taking in equal measure. The Kushtaka had forgotten the giving part. It only took, I know what you are, I said, pulling my medical kit around to where I could reach it. My grandmother told stories about you. You're not a healer. You're a predator that wears healing like camouflage. The creature's eyes narrowed. Your grandmother's stories are obsolete. We offer true medicine now. No, I said, finding what I needed in my kit. You offer slavery. The syringe contained ketamine, a powerful anesthetic I carried for emergency procedures. But more importantly for this situation, it was one of the drugs my mother had taught me about. Ketamine had been derived from traditional plant medicines, used to break spiritual possessions, to sever connections between entities and their victims. I jammed the needle into the Kushtaka's extended arm and depressed the plunger. The creature shrieked, a sound like ice breaking, like seals dying. The water column collapsed, splashing down around us. The blue-green light in the ice walls flickered and dimmed. Impossible, it gasped. We are beyond your primitive chemistry. Maybe, I said, pulling out a second syringe. But this isn't just chemistry. The second injection contained something my mother had prepared years ago. A combination of traditional plant extracts and modern pharmaceuticals, designed to break supernatural healing bonds. I'd carried it for 14 years without ever understanding why. Now I knew. The Kushtaka's form began to blur, shifting between otter and human, between solid and liquid. You cannot stop the great work. Too many have already been transformed. I injected the mixture into Marcus's foreline. The transformation began to reverse immediately, fins retracting, gills sealing shut, human features returning. He gasped and coughed up glacier water, but started breathing air again. "Lisa," I called, preparing a third syringe. "I can fix this. I can make you human again." But Dr. Park shook her head. "I chose this, Margaret. The cancer would have killed me in 6 months. Now I'll live forever." The Kushtaka was weakening, its form becoming less stable. But it wasn't finished. "The healer's choice," it whispered. "Take my place, become what I am. Save your friends, and carry on the great work." For a moment, I almost said yes. The power to heal anything, to transform death into life, to eliminate suffering. What doctor wouldn't want that? Then I remembered the Hippocratic Oath. "First, do no harm." "No deal," I said. I used my last syringe on myself, injecting the traditional medicine directly into my bloodstream. The Kushtaka's influence. 14 years of enhanced healing abilities, supernatural cold resistance, the strange connection I'd felt to injured people, all of it began to fade. The creature let out a final shriek and dissolved into ordinary water, splashing across the cavern floor. The ice walls cracked and began to collapse. Jake Morrison found us 20 minutes later, rappelling into the collapsing crevasse with 2 other rangers. By then, Dr. Chen had made her way up from the deeper caves, confused and hypothermic but human again. Marcus was unconscious, but breathing normally. Only Dr. Park was still transformed, and she refused medical reversal. "How do we explain this?" Jake asked as we loaded the survivors onto evacuation stretchers. I looked at Lisa Park with her 4 arms and black eyes, at the strange medical equipment arranged around the collapsed caverns, at the lingering blue-green stains in the ice. "Toxic exposure," I said. "Unknown chemical compounds from glacier melt. Caused hallucinations and temporary physical changes. Dr. Park will require long-term specialized treatment." Jake nodded. "In the wilderness, sometimes the official explanation is whatever keeps everyone safe and sane." 6 months later, I left the Ranger Service and opened a private practice in Anchorage, emergency medicine with a specialty in wilderness trauma. But I also quietly started incorporating some of my mother's traditional healing methods, the real ones, not the supernatural enhancements I'd lost. Dr. Park disappeared from the research facility after 2 weeks. Security footage showed her walking out in the middle of the night, heading north toward the glaciers. Sometimes other rangers report strange sightings. A figure with too many arms helping with mountain rescues, saving people who should have died from exposure. I don't search for her. And I don't go back to the Chugach Valley, because sometimes, late at night when I'm treating a patient who should have died, I still feel the temptation. The Kushtaka's offer echoes in my mind. Perfect healing, perfect medicine. All I'd have to do is give up my humanity. The traditional medicine works well enough. I save most of my patients, and the ones I lose die as humans, with their souls intact. It's not perfect healing, but it's honest healing. And in the mountains north of Anchorage, the glaciers continue to retreat. Climate change, the scientists say. But sometimes I wonder if something else is making them melt. Something that learned too much about human medicine and is still out there, perfecting its great work. I keep a syringe of my mother's mixture in my medical kit, just in case. Because healing and transformation aren't the same thing. And sometimes the cure is worse than the disease.